When you hear about the circular economy, it's often painted as this amazing economic opportunity, a new way of living, opportunities for economic growth and job creation. And as you can imagine, this could be great news for developing economies. The trouble is, it's just not that simple. If it were, many of us would already be doing it. Now, don't get me wrong. There are huge opportunities within the circular economy. And the circular economy will change the way we live and operate our businesses. But it's just not as easy as many would make it seem or perhaps want it to be. So one of the issues I believe needs to be more broadly understood is that when we talk about collection and recycling, we need to appreciate that the value recovered from selling the materials seldom offsets the cost of doing so. This is the heart of the problem, and it's why the concept of EPR is so important. So this is where I want to start. I like to explain it like this. EPR is about closing the gap. What gap, may you ask? Well, I want you to think about the recycling value chain in two halves. On the left-hand side, you have the cost of collecting, sorting, cleaning, and processing the recyclables into a form that can be used by a converter. And on the right-hand side, you have what someone's willing to pay for that recycled material. So it's a principle that's really common to many commercial supply chains. But the best example I can think for comparison is mining. Now, many of you know I'm from South Africa, and South Africa has been built on a history of mining. And so we're very familiar with sort of examples of gold mining. Now, in gold mining, gold is extracted from rock deep underground. They're always crushed and treated to isolate the gold, and the gold is then refined and finally sold. Now, like mining, the challenge with recycling is that sometimes the cost to recover and process the recyclables exceeds the value that someone's willing to pay for them. Like mining, the end-use price can be influenced by market forces over which you've got no control. Oil price, local exchange rate, supply and demand, global pandemics even. Now in mining, when the gold price drops or the exchange rate moves, as we're familiar with in South Africa, we hear about mines closing shafts or shutting down completely. Critically, they typically aren't shutting down because there's no gold left. They stop operating because it doesn't make economic sense to continue. In recycling, the same applies. At some time, it doesn't make economic sense to keep recycling. Or it only makes sense to dig so deep, as it were. And by that, I mean drive so far or collect certain materials. The difference is that we aren't okay with recyclables being left on the curbside or being sent to landfill when this happens. And so EPR is about closing the economic gap to ensure that recycling continues even when it otherwise wouldn't make economic sense. Now, I know some of you are going to challenge my earlier assertion that the circular economy needs assistance. So let me expand a bit. The reality is that value chains for different materials and different environments have a huge impact on the size of the gap I mentioned. The other critical factor that needs to be appreciated is the collection rate. Many recyclable materials will be recycled with little or no assistance at low levels. So this is the organic recycling or unassisted recycling I mentioned earlier. In developing markets for PET bottles, this is typically in the range of 15 to 30%, depending on the socioeconomic environment and factors like proximity to a port or a recycler. So yes, you don't always need to fund recycling. But we are not going to be satisfied with 20 to 30% collection of PET bottles, for example. As Coca-Cola, we've set ourselves a target of 100% collection. And most governments are setting targets in the 60s and 70s, and in some markets, even in the 80s, 80% ranges. The challenge is that as we increase the collection and recycling rate, the costs tend to escalate, and that gap we spoke about earlier starts to open. To increase the recycling rate further, we have to pay more to a collector or to a waste management company to collect more. We have to travel further to pick up bottles from smaller towns outside the major cities. And then we have to accept colored bottles and dirty bottles, increasing the processing losses and increasing the processing costs. All of these factors increase the cost on the left-hand side of our equation, and in so doing, increase the EPR gap. And so whilst at 20% we didn't have a gap, at 60% we now have a relatively large gap. So how do we close this gap? Well, there are really two categories of intervention. The first is that we can subsidize and therefore effectively reduce the cost on the left-hand side of the equation, or we need to pay more for the recycled content on the right-hand side. In practice, it's generally a combination of the two. But critically, these are typically not passive or spontaneous. They require intent and intervention. And without this, the circular economy just doesn't start turning. So from the previous slide, I hope I managed to demonstrate that the needs of the collection and recycling value chains change over time. So even without external market-related shocks, and this means that the kinds of policies and interventions required must also change. So this evolution of policy and the approach is something that we see across the world today.